On this episode of China Unscripted, as the Chinese Communist Party spreads authoritarianism around the world, can democratic countries resist if America fails to stand up for freedom? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnesta.
And joining us once again is Cleo Paskal, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
You said that with lots of vim and vigor.
Vim and vigor and vinegar. So, Cleo, you have been on a little bit of a world tour, culminating in the highlight, coming to join us in person in our underground bunker.
In rural Quebec?
In rural Quebec. I thought we were under the Empire State Building.
It's both at the same time.
Well, it's just really deep, so it's actually got that intersection.
Yeah.
It's deep, but at an angle.
It burrows straight towards the Poutine.
Yes, at the bottom.
The underground fountain of cheese and gravy.
Thanks for joining us.
That is the molten core of the planet.
That's true. It's what the scientists don't want you to know. It's a deep state plan to hide that the Earth is made out of poutine, and that's why when the asteroid hit the Earth, the moon, which is made out of cheese,
Exactly.
broke off because it's all cheese. Layers of cheese.
That actually tied together well.
You know, I feel like that is actually a very coherent conspiracy theory. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I've been practicing. Yes, I've started my own disinformation campaign. I should actually be careful of saying that. That could get me in trouble.
And of course, Poutine is the way that in Quebec you pronounce Putin,
Really?
the real overlord. So there's a whole other layer to this.
So Ukraine is currently being invaded by French fries with cheese and gravy.
It is coming from the core of the earth, yeah. I wish that were the case as opposed to the reality, but yeah.
So India, you were in India.
Yes, I was. I was just in India for the first time since the pandemic. So it's been a long time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know one time when we had you on, you had some very enlightening things to say about how India was sort of viewing the invasion of Ukraine, which was more recently
Yeah.
when we had you on.
I did. Yeah, and going there was very helpful because there's a feeling you get when you're in a country that you don't get as much if you just
Like a handful of poutine.
Yeah, that's right. Sort of a squishy, warm feeling, delicious feeling of that's exactly what it was like. It's been India's been through a lot. Last time I was there was November 2019, and so since then, obviously they had the pandemic, but they also have had the whole Ukraine thing, which has been a diplomatic issue, but it's also been an inflation issue for food and fuel, and it's also been a diplomatic shock to their system because. The feeling is, and I'm just reporting what the feeling is out of among the large number of people that I had the privilege of speaking with, is that India has been unfairly targeted for doing things like buying Russian oil, continuing to buy Russian fossil fuels, because Europe is doing it. A lot of other countries are doing it as well in larger amounts. And the impression in India is that the targeting, and look at what China's been doing with Russia, for example, but China is being presented as part of the solution and India is being presented as the entirety of the other world problem. So they still haven't even recovered from Afghanistan, what happened with Afghanistan, with the withdrawal and the leaving behind of the tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons that have gone into the hands of terrorists who are antithetical to India. And the U.S. also left behind biometrics of people who had worked with the U.S. and in some cases worked with India. And the numbers that I heard from some Indians is heartbreaking. And we're talking about over 30,000 people who were identified and killed via those biometrics for having collaborated or worked with, supported the United States.
And these people were killed in India?
Afghanistan. Yeah, like door to door. Like they have the database, they know who you are, they have your fingerprints, your iris scans, whatever. And go and kill you in front of your family so nobody else does it ever again. So I think there's been a real lack of understanding about how that withdrawal affects how the rest of the world thinks about operating with the U.S. at that kind of a level on the ground.
Well, this is this very serious issue because, India occupies this very unique space where, it has many reasons to be suspicious of China, to say the least. But it also doesn't fit in neatly with, the sort of Western world order either. For reasons like, I wouldn't say allied, but close ties to Russia, but also at the same time, lots of reasons to not be happy with how it's been treated by the Western world.
Yeah. And so the ideas of the Western world they become kind of complicated. So I wouldn't even.
What do you mean?
Yeah. So I wouldn't even know how to define it, given the actions of the Western world over the last 3 or 4 years, if you're looking at it from the point of view of a country like India. So how would you define the Western? Is it just geographic? Is it ethnic? Is it moral? How would you describe it now?
The West?
Yeah.
I think of the West as being kind of like Western Europe plus North America plus Australia, New Zealand, kind of. So it's partly geographic, but obviously Australia and New Zealand don't fit in with that. It's partly language, although much of Europe doesn't fit in with that. It's partly values, although obviously there's a range of values across that territory anyway. So it's complicated.
So if you're in India and those are the countries you're picking,
right?
It's skin color. I'm just saying how that would be perceived. You're talking about countries that historically have been predominant. In the modern era, colonies, pre-colonial, another issue, but post-colonial are dominantly white.
Right.
So yeah.
And I hesitated because I was going to say Taiwan and Japan as well.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure, and because in many ways those two countries are aligned with the West very much in terms of their values, but they're not typically considered part of the West, right?
This is what India's grappling with also, right? What is this? What's going on? And India and Japan have been getting much closer, and India and Taiwan have had a good relationship, and I think it's quietly getting much closer as well. And I think that there has been concern over the behavior of this. The other thing is that's also confusing, apart from what is the West, is what is the United States. So the State Department has a very different attitude towards India than the Department of Defense does.
Okay, well, can you lay out each of those?
The Department of Defense looks at India and says, these people do share our values and our priorities, which is China and secondarily extremism, perfectly. And they're willing to fight. The Indian military is on the border and with China and has proven it's willing to fight.
Yeah, their soldiers have actually fought Chinese soldiers.
They've killed the PLA soldiers who attacked them. And they're ready to do it again. And they want people to know they're ready to do it again because they think that that's, first of all, they are. But second of all, that's how you get people not to do it again. To say, we're willing to do this again. So there's a lot of compatibility. And there was an article that came out recently about the U.S. sharing real-time information with India about Chinese activities on the border that allowed India to defend itself better. And this is all part of the agreements like BECA that were signed under the previous administration. So it's sort of coming to fruition. So there's no real problem between the Department of Defense and the Indian defense and security establishment. State is a whole other universe. Do you know how long it takes an Indian to get an interview for a tourist visa to come to the U.S.?
How long does it take?
It currently takes, if you're applying in Delhi, a little over 500 days.
Wow, over a year.
Yeah. So if your cousin is getting married or you want to be there for the birth of your grandchild or something like that, good luck.
Yeah.
How long does it take somebody in Shanghai?
How long?
About 5 working days.
Why? Why is that the way?
So that's what the Indians are asking themselves. I write for a newspaper called the Sunday Guardian in India, and they did a front page story saying that the reason was very specifically Victoria Nuland. They named her and said that she was not happy with India's position on Ukraine and was punishing India for it. There are a lot of other reasons that can feed into it, but nobody ever countered that piece.
But was it like that 2 years ago or before COVID?
So I'm not sure. I don't think it's ever been this bad. And in fact, at the height, when they wrote the article initially, it was over 800 days. Yeah. So it's gotten better since that article came out. And the excuse that was given by Secretary Blinken was backlog, COVID, understaffed, to which the Indians go, well, look at what's happening with the Chinese visas. They had all the same conditions. So I'm reporting perception and data points and how those data points are perceived. And that's the issue with state. They're not super pleased with the new ambassador to India either, Garcetti, has had some PR issues. I'm not going to say anything. Google it. So they're not happy with him, but they're going to take him. But the President Biden insisted on him, held this space open for 2 years, even though there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for him until they could get him in. So this is a quad country, and they left the seat open in order to get in this guy from the U.S. side. So the relationship between state and India is very different than the relationship between Department of Defense and India.
Right. So, in terms of working with India to counter China, whether it's a future conflict with Taiwan or just the kind of ongoing non-kinetic warfare that China is doing, whether it's, economic espionage, psyops, drug warfare, et cetera. In terms of if the Department of Defense can work with India, then that sounds like it would be helpful in a future kinetic war. But all the other stuff that's happening is really not DoD territory. It's maybe State Department territory, or maybe we're actually not even sure whose territory it is. But nonetheless, how is the Indian people's negative perception of the U.S. affecting our ability to work together to counter China?
So there are multiple things happening at the same time. You remember the comprehensive national power concept, right? And China's goal to be number one, and that can involve two things. One is they get better, the other is everybody else gets worse. Now, the position of everybody else, in this case the U.S., can get worse because of something China does, or it can get worse because countries that should be allies are starting to peel away because they're concerned about the behavior of the U.S. So even though India is clearly fighting China in ways that the U.S. hasn't even started to, like banning TikTok and WeChat and all that sort of stuff in a day in June 2020. And they want that better relationship with the U.S. because of U.S. behavior and perceptions that, for example, now you're stalling our visas. Maybe next you're going to be trying to use financialization to punish us. Maybe you're going to be trying to cut us out of the SWIFT system for whatever reason, or you're going to be trying to affect in the same way that you're using if you don't like what we're doing. That there's that lack of trust or concern has come into that relationship. So we talk a lot about China trying to internationalize the renminbi or create, but according to what I heard at meetings in India in this last trip, India's signed currency reciprocity relationships with 18 countries, not China, with 18 other countries. So these are countries where, they can start to pay for each other's goods I don't even know. I don't know what the details of it are. This was the first time I had heard about it, so I need to look into it in more detail. But the source was sound. So they're moving away from the U.S. system for their own preservation, not to help China, but because they're concerned about the direction the U.S. is going in. So in a comprehensive national power matrix, that has the potential to lower the U.S. vis-a-vis China, even though that's not the intended consequence. The intended consequence is self-preservation.
So do you think that China is any way trying to amplify this gap between the U.S. and India? I mean, it sounds like we're doing a good job all by ourselves, but
so they'll try to do that, and they'll also try to weaken India itself. So we've gone through all of that before, but try to create social divisions, fund terrorist movements, fund, and a lot happens not only but via Pakistan, because they have common goals to weaken India in that respect. So they're very good at what they do, and they'll take any advantage they can to try to create that issue. But it's worth going through, how the U.S. or the West, the perception of the West has been damaged since 2007, 2008. So the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 really affected the perception of the integrity of the Western economic system, financial system, with the credit default swaps and all this. People had no idea there was that much, I don't know how to even describe it, but going on in the system, that sort of camouflaged near criminality that going on in the system. So that happened. Then you had, just jumping forward to recently, the way that the response to COVID was handled was not particularly well received in a lot of the rest of the world that deals with serious illnesses all the time, like Ebola and things like that. There is this perception that this was this kind of crazy overreaction that was economically incredibly damaging to everybody concerned. But even more so, sorry?
So you're saying, so India viewed the U.S.'s response to COVID as extreme.
So they locked down initially, and then they saw what was happening to their society and said, yeah, we can't do this. I mean, we have too many people who will die of starvation or, suicide or whatever if we have to kind of reopen. But there was a lot of pressure to try to force India to do all the things the West was doing. But this is
which was based on all of the best science, definitely.
So that's the second part of this, which is that there was so that actually what that thing did actually was help. And I'm using India as an example, but I know from colleagues in Africa, for various African countries, for example, that they also thought that this was just insane. And the second part, the science part, was there was a loss in credibility in things like the Lancet, right? So these were always, if you were a scientist in India, you wanted to get published in what you had considered to be these prestigious Western institutions. And not only were they seemingly heavily politicized, but there was an active attack on the Indian scientists who were saying maybe there's something else going on here and maybe there are different ways of treating it. And, we know about the different things that were going on in India. And there was I'm not a scientist, I'm just saying, there was no scientific discussion about the validity of some of these other approaches. They were just shut down. And we saw that in some of the correspondence that was released at the NIH. So you've got a hit to the credibility of the West as a viable or reliable financial center, as a global governance leader, as a center for pure scientific inquiry. And then combine that with Afghanistan, and you have a strategic crisis, loss of faith in strategic legitimacy.
So China definitely sees the U.S. in decline and feels it can become an alternative to a U.S.-led world order. I mean, that's behind, I think, a lot of what they are, how they're portraying themselves as a potential peacemaker in Ukraine. The recent meeting between Xi and Putin talking about this basically a new world order that's led outside of the U.S. Because really, how appealing is that anymore?
So, yes, but the rest of the world doesn't buy it, right? I mean, you're talking to even Pacific Island countries don't buy it. I mean, nobody wants. I mean, unless you're a proto-authoritarian who wants to destroy your own country, you're not hugely attracted by the Chinese system. So this is why India is particularly important, because the question is whether it can coalesce another alternative.
You mean not the U.S., not China?
Yeah, but it's funny because I think the U.S. has this crisis of legitimacy now. The West has. I mean, I was at this conference in India, and it was a very interesting conference with people from the Indian government and also and think tanks and things like that. And the guest of honor was the former president of Croatia, and she had never been to India before, and she stood up there and lectured the Indians about Ukraine, right? And the person who had spoken before her was the Maharana of the region. He was he was the 77th in his line. And his ancestor had fought off the Mongols, right? And here is this woman showing up from, lovely lady, I'm sure she's very smart, showing up from Croatia saying, you need to take Ukraine very importantly. And here is this guy, 77th generation of leader, who's fought off invasion after invasion after invasion, who has more geopolitical experience than is conceivable of, saying we need to think about a whole different range of things as well. So the sophistication and experience in India is something that I consistently learn from. But when the West comes and lectures to them, it just further shows that there isn't an understanding of their operational realities. And the question is, India has the G20 this year, and they're openly trying to find another alternative. And I'm not sure when we talk about the U.S. being a leader or whatever, what I want is a world that is safe for democracy, free speech, transparency, accountability, all of those things. And any country that's willing to lead on that is great. And
would you say India is a country that has democracy and free speech?
I think it's a country of over 1 billion people. That's very complicated, but I think it's really trying. And it's the civil society is very active, and you can criticize it in a million different ways, but you can criticize any country like that in a million different ways. And what they've managed to accomplish, given the incredible aggression on their borders, is a real testament to the Indian people. I was at that conference, and I have no idea what the religions or whatever of the participants were. They just all wanted to work towards a better, stronger, more democratic India. So considering that in 1947, they were left broken into 500 different princely estates and totally all the richness that could be carried, taken away. What they've accomplished in that amount of time is remarkable. Story isn't over, but you can't compare them to countries that haven't had that happen to them. You can compare them to other countries that did and see how far they've come. I think, if I was a young person. I'd much prefer to be a young person in India than in many, many other countries. I think my ability to craft my own future and fulfill my potential in many cases is much higher. I mean, especially compared to its neighbors, all different directions. But the point is that India wants to lead on these issues, right? It wants to, in its G20 role, deliver more prosperity for the poor, more opportunities for its business sectors, more education, more health, all those sorts of things. And that's not a rhetoric that I see being enacted by countries we think of in the West. I mean, the president of Croatia didn't show up and say, let's work together to build businesses so that your poor can lift themselves up out of poverty and get better educations and all that sort of stuff. She said, why aren't you helping us on Ukraine? Now, Ukraine is incredibly important, and Russia shouldn't. What Russia did was absolutely wrong. But what all of this is about is the perception in non-Western countries about what's going on in the West and what's going on in China and how they're going to find a way through that. Does this make any sense?
It does to me. Well, so if, China obviously has a coherent plan for global domination, and they're very successful. In a lot of ways, it does seem like the West, and particularly the United States, is fractured. If the U.S. fails at countering China, for example, allows Taiwan to be invaded and taken, is there any hope that India, on its own or in some kind of coalition with other countries, would they be able to stand up to a Chinese threat?
They will try. Unless there's, it's a democracy, and China's targets the democratic processes in other countries. So one of the newspaper stories, for example, that was out while I was there was about an embassy, a non-NATO European country's embassy in Delhi. It was Ukraine. I mean, there was no other opinion. That was hosting, according to the report, and I know the reporter, and he's very good, that was hosting meetings of non-resident Indians and other Europeans to try to put together an information campaign to defeat Modi at the next election because of India's position on Ukraine. Okay, so if the goal is regime change in India because you don't like Prime Minister Modi's position on Ukraine and you're willing to get in whoever you want, whoever will tell you what you want to hear on Ukraine, then what you want is a compliant government. And in my experience, if they're compliant to you, they'll be compliant to whoever pays a bit more than you or whoever's rougher than you. Right, which is why this whole, approach in the Pacific Islands of dealing with compromised leaders doesn't work, because the Chinese are they're tougher than you and they've got more money than you. So if the goals are that narrow, and you try to do that kind of a thing, and you get a different government in place in India, then I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, though, given the U.S. and particularly the CIA's experience with regime change in, say, South America, I would say, why not try our hand in India?
To what end?
I think Matt's trying to joke and it's not coming off.
All right. So, hey, no, we're done with that, Matt. Spray bottle. So this is interesting because you brought up the Pacific Islands, and I know part of your tour was also in the North Pacific. And what we see there is sort of a similar thing with what you're talking about with India, where they are also under a very immense threat from the Chinese Communist Party, but also the West, and in particular America, has failed them terribly. So this is a similar situation. What are these countries and peoples talking about when they're stuck between, it's the opposite of an immovable object and an unstoppable force. It's something that's completely weak and falling apart, and then something that's coming to eat them.
So this is this thing about who is leading the world on fighting for democracy and human rights and things. And you're seeing it across the Pacific. Like, there are all of these leaders that are standing up and risking their personal safety because they actually believe in these ideals. And the main one now is David Panuelo, the president of the Federated States of Micronesia, who wrote this incredible letter that everybody should read. And in fact, there was a committee hearing recently, and Representative Brad Sherman entered it into the record and said every world leader should read this letter. It's 13 pages long, and the whole first section of it, he details and he calls it political warfare and gray zone activity in his country. And he names the Chinese diplomats and what they've been doing, and talks about how he's been personally threatened, he's followed, but also how they're funding independence movements within his country to break up the country. How he didn't want to send a representative to a certain meeting sponsored by China, so China selected one of the citizens of his country and brought him to the meeting and said he was a representative of the entire country, completely bypassing the normal political process.
Smooth.
Yeah. How he actually, China wanted to send an ambassador to his country that he knew was an intel agent, basically. And so he refused that ambassador. And China's just sitting around waiting for him to lose the election so that they can send that ambassador. And he did lose the election. And so that ambassador will be coming and sitting in the capital of Federated States of Micronesia. But it's everything that you've kind of heard rumors about. But the president of a country is saying, yeah, this is exactly what's happening. And he goes through it all. And then at the end, he says, and that's why I want to de-recognize China and recognize Taiwan.
That hasn't happened
since
right?
2007. And he says it's to protect my country and my people and to get us away from the PRC, which wants to undermine our values and buy off our politicians for their own best interest. And in the letter, he talks about politicians coming back with envelopes full of cash and all this. I mean, it's a plea from a Pacific island to be liberated from an aggressive Asian power, right? This is the political warfare equivalent of World War II. And he says that we can't just pull off from China because it'll leave these huge holes in the budget. So there's money involved. The amounts of money, and he says it in the letter. He puts it all out there. He says, look, we need $50 million over 3 years, and then the provinces need this amount. And the amounts are...
$50 million is so tiny from the perspective of, like, the U.S., for example.
Yeah.
It's like, we're spending, $1 billion on, a new bomber plane or an aircraft carrier or something.
That's probably fuel for the bomber plane. For an hour.
So
it's just literally the money being burned as fuel.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's what they're asking is so small.
Yeah, and it's completely transparent. There's nothing going into anybody's pocket. And he says he's spoken to the Taiwanese foreign minister about it, spoke to Wu about it, and he said that the Taiwanese would complete the projects that China had started. They started a stadium and all that stuff, and the Taiwanese would complete it and hire locals. So that's a bit extra money, but it's not that much. This letter came out on March 9th, and nothing's happened.
From Washington's perspective, or?
Okay, have you heard of a recognition of Taiwan coming out of Micronesia?
No, but we did hear in March that Nicaragua had de-recognized Taiwan.
Honduras.
Honduras. Thank you.
I think
They're all
Nicaragua
the
was,
same.
Nicaragua was a couple.
It was-
years
They
ago.
did it
yeah.
a few years ago.
yeah.
So Honduras has recently, the most recent one to switch.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting political warfare question. Why has everybody heard about Honduras and nobody's heard about Micronesia?
Because Micronesia didn't actually switch to Taiwan.
But we heard about Honduras threatening to switch. We heard about the whole lead up to it until it happened. And now we're not hearing about because if you don't hear about it, it doesn't create the momentum.
It's because nobody knows
I actually
where.
saw a article and it said the outgoing president of Micronesia. The headline was the outgoing president of Micronesia. So then the impression you get is that this guy's just a lame duck and he's saying this, but then it won't actually happen.
So he has this. It's an interesting legal question. What he's trying to do is take the hit for the successor. So he's in power until about May. He thinks he has the legal ability to do it. And if you think about somebody like Sogavari flipped Solomons from Taiwan to China without Congress or anything. He just did it unilaterally. So the FSM system is a little bit more complicated, but he knows, or I know he thinks he can do it. And he wants to do it to make it a fait accompli for the person who comes next. Now, Taiwan won't do it. I mean, I've been thinking about this a long time. I was in Taiwan recently, talked to a lot of people there about it. And I think Taiwan won't do it unless State Department signs off on it.
Mm-hmm.
So then what you're doing is, because the other thing they're saying is, oh, maybe they'll switch back or things like that. But if what it is the U.S. saying to the world, and especially to the politicians in Federated States of Micronesia, which is a compact state, so it has a very unique relationship with the U.S., we support this decision to switch to Taiwan. So it's not just about you and Taiwan. It's about you and the U.S. and Taiwan. And ideally, Japan would join that as well. Then you're creating a safety buffer for the new president when he comes in to continue with that position. And in an ideal world, because there are three compact states, if you remember, there's Palau, Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia. Palau and Marshall Islands already recognize Taiwan. Mm-hmm. So if you even had an event where you had the two presidents, the president of Marshall Islands, president of Palau, somebody from the U.S., President Tsai, all welcoming Micronesia back into the family of freedom, that's a really strong message. It's a huge political warfare win on a field that we've almost given up on. And last thing, geographically, as you can see by this map,
there won't be a map.
if Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau all recognize Taiwan, then you have this zone of freedom that goes from Hawaii through the Central Pacific and up to Taiwan. So from a strategic perspective, from an operational military perspective, it's incredibly important.
Well, so that seems like something the State Department should be all about.
Did you just hear about the State Department recently?
I seem to remember someone saying something not great things about it, like
but
5 or 10 minutes ago.
But also, like, you talk about this like it's really important for countries to recognize Taiwan instead of the PRC. But the United States, the most influential country in the West, has not recognized Taiwan since 1970, I forget, 79, something like that.
Sure.
Like, how can the U.S. say that the Federated States of Micronesia, or even sign off on that, given that the U.S. is such a big fat hypocrite?
So the U.S. doesn't seem to have a problem with that, with
being a big fat hypocrite. No, I agree with you on that, actually.
Yeah. So I think that it could certainly be done. I also think, of course, that the U.S. should just admit the obvious, that there is an independent country that runs its own elections and controls its own borders and whatnot called Taiwan.
But we can't use the C word. Country.
Oh, yeah, I can. Yeah. It's the C in the context of China word that makes me a little bit nervous. But yeah, I wouldn't call it, Republic of China. but I would certainly call it Taiwan. But that said, did I tell you about what happened with Palau and Taiwan and the Our Oceans Conference?
No, I don't believe so.
So a little over a year ago, there was a bit more than a year ago, there was an international conference about oceans in Palau. Palau, remember, recognizes Taiwan. They wanted to invite President Tsai. Taiwan has built a lot of buildings, been a very good partner for Palau. You see the Taiwanese flag all over the place when you go through Koror, for example. And the U.S., according to people in Palau, the U.S. said, you know what? You can't invite Tsai because then Secretary Kerry can't come.
Oh, I remember this now.
Yeah,
Yes.
I do remember that.
And by the way, we want you to cover over all of the Taiwanese flags on the buildings.
And so this is like what you've been talking about this whole podcast, just the U.S.
Not the U.S. as a whole.
Not the U.S. as a whole.
State
yes.
Department.
Currently, we are in the U.S. and we're saying these things, but
No, we're in Quebec, so we have to be
that's
precise
right.
about our neighbor to the south.
But yeah, the U.S. government at least seems to just be making these horrible decisions that,
Or at least the State Department.
at least the State Department.
So there's a level above the State Department, which is the National Security Council. So, you know, which is basically kind of the president goes to that. So you can, if a decision was made that this was strategically important, for example, currently going through these negotiations for the compacts of free association, and that seems to be considered something that's important. And that was decided through the appointment of a presidential ambassador level post Yoon to deal with those negotiations. If you're saying these three countries are that important, then maybe you would prioritize the Taiwan thing, even though State Department has some fluffiness on it. This gets back to the question from the very beginning, which is what does the U.S. really stand for right now, in terms of what it presents to its allies is what it stands for. And the Panuelo letter is. Panuelo, as you said, he's lost the election, so he'll only be president until May something. There's a timeline on this. If this is rejected, if they don't recognize Taiwan, no other country is going to offer again. Right? This is the biggest, most dangerous statement an individual leader can make, and the Chinese will go after him. They'll go after him, they'll go after his family, they'll go after anybody who facilitated this offer long after he leaves office, because it's the killing the chicken to scare the monkeys thing. They have to make sure that he's dead and buried and nobody ever wants to replicate it.
Kind of like the terrorists in Afghanistan going door to door and killing people in front of their families. It's almost like there's a similar thing.
That's why these leaders are some of the most courageous moral people on the planet, right? If you're talking about who's leading the free world, I would argue David Panuelo is one of the biggest leaders of the free world going at the moment. Daniel Suidani is another one. There are these people who have put their lives on the line to defend freedom.
Speaking of Suidani, I heard, he can't stay in the Solomon Islands for safety reasons. He's trying to get to the U.S. How's that going?
So I think he can go to the Solomons. It is going to be dangerous for him. There's an incredible political warfare campaign against him. You've spoken to him, former premier of Malaita province. His province, when Solomons flipped to China in 2019, September. In October, they put out the Auki communique, which said for environmental, political, moral reasons, they didn't want any CCP-linked companies operating in the province. And then there was incredible pressure put on them to try to change their mind. But they stuck with it. So when Prime Minister of Solomon said he was going to bring in he was going to borrow over $60 million US from the Chinese to put in 161 Huawei towers, Malaita province said, we don't want the 30 plus towers you're going to put in our province. Like, they stuck with it. Now, that meant enemy number one in the country for the Chinese, right? It's like a Panuelo situation. You have to hammer down those nails that are sticking their head up, or other nails might pop up and your whole structure might start to become shaky and fall apart. So they put in all this money, managed to buy off enough people so that there was a vote of no confidence. He lost the premiership. He was then invited by an NGO to come to the U.S. to speak at an environmental conference about Indigenous leadership, because part of his whole thing is, we don't want the Chinese here because of the way they do logging and they just destroy the environment. And we care about our environment and we do this Indigenous guardianship of the land. And then he applied for a U.S. visa and he was denied. And it happened to be within days of Kurt Campbell visiting Honiara, the capital of Solomon Islands.
Very suspicious.
And Kurt Campbell has a position in the State Department currently?
He's the Indo-Pacific coordinator at the National Security Council.
Okay.
He was
So
also
higher
the
level.
one responsible for the Scarborough Shoal incident, as I remember.
He was.
Yeah, that was, if I didn't mention in this podcast.
You didn't.
I didn't. That was when China was trying to take over the Scarborough Shoal, very near to the Philippines. Looked like the Philippines and China might have a conflict over that. Kurt Campbell negotiated a deal where China and the Philippines would leave. The Philippines side left, the Chinese side stay, and the U.S. did nothing.
And this was 2012 under Obama.
Yeah. And it became known as the Scarborough Shoal model inside China, the idea that, like, you can do this salami slicing and the U.S. won't react. And this was the start of the artificial islands in the South China Sea, the militarization. This is just another example of the U.S. failing as a leader of a free democratic world.
So the question is this Scarborough Shoal 2.0? Because what they did with Scarborough Shoal was a physical possession. This is a possession of Solomon's, the land of Guadalcanal, where all of that American blood is soaked into the beaches, through political warfare. So the question is it going to be the same approach where, we can negotiate with the Chinese and we can come to an agreement and, they'll follow through. Sogavare said he wouldn't have a military base. I mean, that's what's actually happening right now.
Yeah.
Okay. And at the same time, the people who are willing to fight for it, in the other case, it was the Philippines. In this case, it's, Daniel Suidani and the people of Malaita, aren't seemingly getting any backing. Right. So this is really, I really hope I'm wrong, but it is starting to look like exactly the same sort of approach that created Scarborough Shoal. And the same with Panuelo. If we let Panuelo recognize Taiwan, then the Chinese will get mad. Now, we don't want to get the Chinese mad. We need them on climate change. And anyways, they said they would behave and all this sort of stuff.
And they always do when they say so.
So, yeah, it's not encouraging.
Well, this really is a grim picture where, the U.S. is failing at its role of being a leader for a free world. So the question is, how can the U.S. reassume that role? And worst case scenario, if the U.S. really does fail at that, what can all these other countries do? All of the Pacific Island countries, India.
So by the time this is aired, we'll know what happened with Suidani's visa, because he's reapplying. And this is the good news, is that he's had huge congressional bipartisan support. So both chairs of the Pacific Island Caucus, Ed Case from Hawaii and Amata Radewagen from American Samoa, a Democrat and a Republican, have signed a letter to Secretary Blinken, strongly encouraged that they give him a visa, and he has reapplied. And Representative Neil Dunn has made a very strong statement in support as well, and he's from the China Committee, right? So this is this thing. The U.S. never has been monolithic. And as other parts of the U.S. start to find their voice and stand for the things that the U.S. has stood for for the world for so long. I think the position can be maintained, regained, grow, but there has to be an awareness that business as usual is failing. It's a gone out of business sign on the business as usual.
I mean, it really is an incredible story. Like they say, America, the shot heard around the world. The American Revolution, the War of Independence, like all of these countries around the world that we've been talking about are influenced by that act, that War of Independence. Those ideals really caught fire around the world. And China, the Chinese Communist Party, is a major threat to snuff out that fire. And unfortunately, the U.S. that started it all it seems to be stumbling.
There are a lot of people in the islands and elsewhere who truly believe in. They've read the founding documents and they believe in it. They really believe in it, and it's very touching, and it's potentially heartbreaking. But if the shining city on the hill, if that light goes out to a whole bunch of different little villages and is at least stays alive there, so that when the city on the hill is ready to re-illuminate, there's flames. I'm going to lose myself in this
keep
metaphor.
Going.
The candle can light other candles, right?
Yeah, it's the Hanukkah story, really. That's what it is.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's it lasted 8 long nights. But this is kind of what the hope is, that the U.S. will be the beacon, right? But the U.S. has already spread the flame. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Okay. And if the U.S. doesn't snuff out the flame in those other places and allows it to, through real politique and some sort of clever, statesmanship that they think is being clever, like Scarborough Shoal 1.0, then we have a chance to fight it. And it's from the Pacific Islands to India. There are a lot of people out there who just want a chance. They just want democracy. They want court systems that work. They want a free press, and they want to get on with their lives. All of those 3 warfares that China goes after, right? They want them gone. They want to fight back. They want the psychological warfare, the media warfare, and the lawfare. That tells you how China tries to, apart from everything else, get control of the country. So to counter that, you need the free press. You need free thinking, that's the psychological warfare, and you need free judiciary, independent judiciary.
Though you said the 3 warfares, on our last podcast we had Grant Newsham on, and he talked about 24 warfares.
There are, yeah.
There's a lot of warfares.
So he's of course right, and go read his book. The 24 are from unrestricted warfare. The Chinese have overtly said those 3. I think that the ones they don't say are just as important, or if not more so. They don't want to make it public. I think like education, things like that. Yeah. And the drug stuff the fentanyl stuff is horrific.
Yeah. But I think anyone listening to this, I think an issue is there is just a lot of negativity about the United States, even within the United States. But from what we've seen with these other countries believing in these fundamental values, America really is great. People say, well, when was America great? It was great from day one, and it still is. We just have to fire the State Department, I guess.
Yeah. And it is. I was amazed at how many members of Congress were willing to just go to bat for Daniel Suidani's visa. They're not getting anything out of it. Nothing. It was very fast, and they got it immediately. They knew exactly why they needed to support
that's great that.
Yeah, and that was incredibly encouraging, and it goes back to this thing about why Honduras was reported but Micronesia wasn't, right? We continuously report on the negatives. On the Congress, people are doing all sorts of nasty stuff. Much less coverage on people are just doing their jobs on a daily basis and trying to help their constituents and do the right thing and fight for all of the things that you're talking about.
So the secret to covering Micronesia's desire to switch to Taiwan is to focus on the negative, which is that there is a belief that the U.S. State Department might try to destroy this, right? Which is a negative thing.
Correct.
And then it's a fight. There's conflict. All the things that reporters need to cover something.
So what do you think should happen with this Micronesia situation?
At a minimum, the U.S. should not stop them from doing that.
Well, I think by not offering any support or not saying anything, that's effectively stopping it.
Yes.
I don't think the U.S. would probably publicly say that Micronesia should do it. But they could do something like how they let Taiwan transit through the U.S. You know what I mean?
Are you saying what they should do or what they could do?
No, I mean, I'd say at a bare minimum, I could see the State Department at least I don't see the current State Department actually being yes, Micronesia, do it.
Yeah, I mean, because there's two different ways to look at this. One is what's practical given the framework.
Well, hold on,
Matt.
Let Shelley finish her thought about that.
No, I mean, I'm just saying that with the reality of the current State Department.
So what do you think that they could do? What is the equivalent in this case of the allowing Taiwan to transit through New York?
Essentially letting it happen and then being well, we don't tell other countries what to do with their, if they want to recognize Taiwan, they can do that. And China shouldn't make a big deal out of this. That's essentially what they said about the transit, which is this is normal. Mm-hmm. This is what happens. And if China makes a big deal out of it, they're
weird,
being aggressive
silly.
And shouldn't do it.
But they complain after bad things have happened. So there was that article about the hit, about Suidani working with the U.S. to put together a hit squad to take out Sogavari. And after it came out, Kurt Campbell said, it's all disinformation and shameful and that should, whatever. So I don't know whether there's a statement about Honduras afterwards, but the State Department seems to be good at, after the bad thing has happened, making a statement. But I wonder if this is sort of based on what I just saw happen with Suidani, whether maybe there should be congressional support. I mean, if their Congress people are willing to travel to Taiwan, maybe they're willing to support the switch.
And that's a great thing. The State Department is executive branch, Congress, legislative branch. It has power to check the other people.
So maybe the China Unscripted Nation should write to your representatives
and tell them to visit the Federated States of Micronesia.
Tell them to support them in their recognition of Taiwan.
Right. I mean, I actually think that the U.S.
in the comments below.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to say, since we are recording this before we know about Daniel Suidani's getting his visa approved, we'll, in the pinned comment, we'll have the update on that because we should know by the time this comes out.
Yeah. But
which hopefully will be a positive one, considering the context of what we've talked about.
It's already positive because people in Congress put their necks out. But I would also say, be the change, and if you I made it up. If you want Taiwan to have more maneuvering space diplomatically and you think it should be recognized as a country, you've got a few weeks to make that happen. I'm serious about it. Let people know that's what you want to make happen. This is your opening. If you think this is important, if you want to change the narrative, China's been very good at that psychological warfare, that inevitability narrative, we're just going to lose countries one by one by one. Down to 13, it'll be 12, it'll eventually be 0. So you don't want to be the last ones because you're not going to get the payout that you're going to get as we go down the line. But that shift it to, if you truly care about your country, if you're willing to be the democratic leader that you were elected to be and protect your country from the rapaciousness of the PRC, you can switch to Taiwan and have that buffer of security acknowledged. Then you need to let Micronesia and Taiwan become diplomatic partners.
And then that beacon from that shining city on the hill can take the candles of the fire and spread it out to all the nations and peoples.
It's like that torch that you used to sort of scare off a lion or a coyote or something. That's
what world are you coming from? What?
Rural Quebec. You haven't been in.
Were there a lion? There's definitely coyotes. Yeah, I just learned that there are 229 members of Congress in the Congressional Taiwan Caucus.
Wow.
So if your member of Congress is part of that, write them a letter and say, what are you doing about Micronesia?
Or maybe call them.
Yeah. I'm 150 years old. Send a telegram.
I worked as a
pigeon.
I worked as a congressional intern. We have to record all the calls. Like we have to take record of everybody who calls, even the people who call and are crazy. And they call every week to talk about the same crazy thing.
Can we put a link to is there like a website that has where you can call?
Like Google your local congressperson and you can.
But how is somebody supposed to know something like that?
So Shelley, what makes them the most nervous?
What makes them the most calling or writing letters? I think calling. Yeah, like it just
talking to another human being. This is why we use Uber and Grubhub, so we don't have to actually talk to another person.
I mean, it could take them a while to get to your letter.
Yeah, that's true too.
True. Yeah,
and the House or the Senate, both. What's better?
Oh, I worked for a representative, not a senator. But obviously, senators have more power. But I imagine their offices are harder to influence.
So do we think this is a good idea, though? This
it's
insurrection, this democratic insurrection to spread the flame of freedom?
It's the opposite of insurrection. It's literally doing what our government is designed to do. Like
getting people involved. It's civics. It's like 8th grade civics.
What is this revolutionary thing you're doing?
Calling your congressperson?
Trying to get your congressperson to represent you? How dare you?
Yeah, calling them for something other than getting tickets to the White House tour. Like, yeah.
Oh, can you get tickets to the White House tour that way?
You used to be able to. I don't know what happened since COVID, but
what else can you ask for?
Well, you can actually. This is pretty useful if you're having problems with the passport office. Like you've put in your passport for renewal and it's not coming back. You can actually call your local congressperson's office and they will help you with that.
Fascinating.
Fun fact. So I've been on the Hill recently, completely unrelated to absolutely everything we've been talking about. The offices are open again. So so you can just walk in and go and knock on your congressperson's door.
I mean, if you're
I would recommend
visiting
I didn't
DC.
send you, but if you want to see the buildings, you can go.
I mean, you're not gonna. You're only going to be able to talk to the intern
to
who's
the
doing
staff,
the receptionist, but
But nonetheless, like if you're
on tour in Washington, it's kind of fun to do. The buildings are beautiful.
But also, even if you talk with your congressperson's staff, like they're going to take a note of what you say, and they also have influence over what the congressperson does. And so it is the staff's job to also represent you.
Bring candy for the staff. They work really hard and don't get home much.
Let's be the America the rest of the world wants us to be.
Needs us to be. Needs you to be.
Yeah, because you're Canadian.
Yeah. I need you to be, please.
I mean, I do think this is brilliant in a way because you cannot really affect the State Department, right? Yeah, like unless you're Biden or
the only way to affect the State Department is voting for the guy in charge of the executive.
Yeah,
right.
So that
you
comes every 4 years,
right? You can embarrass the State Department by getting your congressperson to stand up for what's right, even if it's in opposition to the State Department.
That's true.
Do people still write letters to their local newspaper?
Are there local newspapers?
I was going to say, let's first talk about local newspapers.
Yeah, but I think the congressperson's a great idea.
I really am.
Facebook.
Post a video on TikTok.
On MySpace.
Oh, MySpace. You.
Tom will help me. He's my friend.
Yeah, he is my friend.
Yeah.
He's my only friend.
Oh my gosh.
Him
Well-
and the paperclip.
Yeah, let's.
Like Clippy from
Yeah,
Micro.
Clippy
Oh
is
my
my
gosh. Well,
like
I
this
didn't
is
think
like
this is where
proto
we would end.
2006, but
but yeah, Cleo.
Does anybody still use Eudora?
What?
What
I've
is
never heard that
Eudora?
word.
No, we so you know how like our podcast, when it's just the three of us, goes way off the rails.
There was this moment where we were so close to having a beautiful end to
about
this podcast.
democracy,
about democracy,
and hope and the
beacon
light of
on the
freedom.
hill, light
Yeah.
of freedom.
If
and now
anybody
we're talking
knows,
about Clippy.
yeah, if anybody knows how to run Eudora on a Intel chip, let me know. This
Eudora.
was like the best email software from the 70s. It was really
It's pre-email.
old. Yeah,
It's so
it was
old.
no, okay, it was from the 90s, but it was really good. Software was better back then.
They had the original Oregon Trail. I mean, that's a great game.
That is a great game.
There's nothing that's even come close to that.
Thanks for
Mormonoids?
watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
And I'm Matt Canesta.
And I'm 150 years old.
Thanks for joining us, Cleo.